Hello everybody, Dr. Dave here. Welcome to Tipsy Vervet. The purpose of our podcast is to help people make sense of life and create meaning. While what we talk about is based on our own experiences with addiction and helping other people who are overcoming addiction, the principles that we share are universal, and we think they'll be helpful to anyone who aims to better understand themselves and who wants to cultivate a life that's worth living, regardless of what their past experiences might be.
I'm Pierre, and I've been involved in the addiction community for over a decade. This podcast is independent of any other work we do, and we're in no way affiliated with anyone else. We hope that the spirit that comes across in our conversations is one of compassion, and that you find it helpful. Hello, and welcome to the podcast. I'm here with my good friend David.
Hello, Pete.
What are we going to talk about today?
I want to talk about expanding on what we did in the previous podcast, and I would encourage everybody to watch that one first. We discussed the concept of what we call shifter. Something happens, I interpret what's happened in some sort of way, usually actually based on my past experiences. And that influences my thoughts, my feelings, and very importantly, it influences how I respond to that, what I do next. And what we said was that you don't live a life of consequences of fate, or you don't live a life actually of God's will. I don't believe so anyway. We live a life of consequences of our own behavior. And that's the important thing. Each one of those things, what we think, how we feel, and how we behave, and thoughts and feelings, even if they don't actually translate into a behavior, they all have consequences. Because if I'm thinking negative thoughts, or I'm feeling threatened, or I'm experiencing emotions that are uncomfortable from me, then the thoughts and feelings that come from those are often negative as well. We see this commonly, of course, in people who are depressed, and I think that probably most, if not all, addicts ultimately will experience depression, because all drugs, including alcohol, which is only a drug, of course, directly cause depression and anxiety. I mean, even if we're on meth, right, you can have a productive 7 days, but ultimately you're going to come down, And what we find is in people who are depressed, it's a really good example. And I think, whenever we talk about addiction, you can substitute the word depression for that, because they were really two sides of the same coin. We have this negative bias. We look out for negative things. We pay attention to negative thoughts and feelings. And in so doing, what we do is we create around us a world that is very negative. And the world that we inhabit is a world of uncomfortable thoughts and feelings and seemingly repeated episodes of things which perpetuate that feeling of discomfort happening to us and the world around us. We interpret people's faces differently, so that we might interpret that they're angry or disgusted or fed up, when in fact they might not be any of those things. So we have this negative bias towards it. We interpret events that happen around us. We take them on, we personalize them, that this only happened because it was to punish me, People don't cut everyone off in the traffic. They only cut me off in the traffic, right? They pick on me. So I think to recognize these things are really important. And last week, what we were talking about was if we can create a framework on how to behave regardless of how we feel and what we're thinking. And that framework is a functional framework, and we called that a framework of virtues, then the outcome of our actions will be the very best they can be for me under those circumstances at that time. So we went into detail last week about that. And it's really important for people, I think, to go back and have a look at that and understand it. So today, I wanted to take a step back and go to the beginning of that shifter. Something happens, and I interpret what happens. and what influences those interpretations. Because what we're actually really talking about here is self-awareness. And we often say that the starting point to finding a life that's worth living, yes, is to the ability to pay attention. And people often say to me, but I can pay attention. What do I need to pay attention to? And the reality is that when we're drinking and when we're using drugs, we don't pay attention to anything. We don't even have any idea about how we're actually feeling, because the feel is too uncomfortable. So we just alter it chemically so that we don't actually even have to experience what we're feeling. But even more so, we become completely inattentive to our thoughts and our feelings. And what happens then is that our thoughts and our feelings take control of us without us even realizing. We become a slave, actually, to the circumstances around us and other people's behavior, because they so profoundly influence our thoughts and our feelings. And without turning our attention to those, and without understanding actually what we're thinking and feeling, then we just automatically respond, often in unhelpful ways and sometimes even self-destructive ways. So I think one of the starting points of attention is to turn attention towards ourselves and develop a sense of self-awareness. Somebody said to me recently, what's the difference between self-awareness and self-pity? Self-pity, of course, is a complete absence of self-awareness. Yeah, it's a sense of feeling sorry for myself just because of the way I feel, instead of saying, well, what is it about my life right now? What is it about my relationships and my behaviors that are contributing to how I feel? And so self-awareness is the exact opposite, actually, of self-pity. It's a lovely sense of curiosity into myself. And when I have this sense of self-awareness now, for the first time, I can choose how to respond to those things. And I just want to be very clear, self-awareness is not about making specifically negative thoughts positive thoughts. Most of our thoughts we don't choose at all. They just arise. And it's important to recognize that. What self-awareness enables us to do is to change our relationship to those thoughts. So despite those thoughts still being there, when we notice them and when we make sense of them, then we can respond to them in a more helpful way. And sometimes, you know what that is? It's just actually acknowledging them and saying, you know what, that's a thought, it just arose, and it's okay. It's okay. So we said, when we were talking about shifter, we said that some of these things that influence the way we respond to things are very, very importantly, of course, past experience. And when I talk about past experience, I'm talking about everything that happened to me up until now. But hugely important in this past experience is our childhood experiences, because those are our formative years. That's when our brain is developing. It's when our sense of self is developing. It's when we learn what it feels like to be me, which it's, some people say, is the true definition of consciousness. What does it feel like to be you? And for some of us, it's quite a distressing realization to realize I don't know what it feels like to be me. And in fact, I've altered my sense of self so much with chemicals that I've never even had the opportunity to learn what it feels like to be me. And this isn't a judgment, right? And I don't mean to sound insensitive, but if we look back, at one point it was too uncomfortable to feel like what it feels like to be me. Or it was too uncomfortable to not know what it felt like to be me, especially as a young child, right? So if you grow in a home where you're criticized all the time, then you're not going to say, hey, people are being unfair to me. If you're a child, you're going to say there's something wrong with me. And you develop profound lack of self-identity and self-awareness and self-compassion and self-esteem. And so what happens is you grow up always wanting to validate your thoughts by having somebody else validate them for you. People have to show you positive emotion and respond to you positively. Otherwise, you start to criticize yourself. If you grow up in a home that's chaotic or even dangerous, where there's violence, or it doesn't have to be physical violence, even just emotional violence, where there's always arguments and friction, then you grow up with this incredible sense of hypervigilance. You're always going to be on edge. And when you grow up into an adult, you're going to take that with you into social situations. And you're going to be cautious of other people. And sometimes it becomes quite difficult, actually, to make relationships with other people. Not necessarily romantic relationships, but what you often find is it's very difficult to find people you relate to and make friends with people. And you also may experience this inner sort of profound sense of aloneness. Not loneliness, right? Because you can feel it even when you're with your own family. It's a sense of, I'm alone. People don't understand me. I don't understand other people. I can't relate to them. So these past experiences have profound impact on us. And as I say, it's not just childhood experiences. It's everything that happened because of those experiences early in my life, I developed this personality, or more accurate, personalities. I'll talk about this in a sec, but we all have multiple personalities. It's important to recognize that because what they do is they talk to each other and you can hear them talking to each other. Right? So the Buddhists talk about, this is my theory, right? The Buddhists talk about, count to 5. Now here's counting to 5. Now see if you can watch the person count to 5. So count 5 in your head again and see if you can watch the person counting to 5. Now, who's watching the person counting to 5, right? And then who's looking for the person who's watching the person counting to 5? And so there's this sort of sense of, well, who am I? Where am I? Is there a me? And I think the answer to that is all of those things. There's a person counting to 5. There's somebody watching the person count to 5. There's somebody looking for the person. There's multiple personalities within us. And it's important to recognize that. And I think people who have personality disorders, perhaps their personality is not talking to each other. And that's where the difficulty lies. So they become separate. Whereas in our healthy minds, our voices and our characters are continually communicating with each other. And they serve different purposes. There's the brave me. There's the more timid me, more reserved me. But there's also the me who criticizes both of those things. And what happens is, as we grow up, if some of those personalities might become damaged in the environment we grow up. And so the me that's braver, because I wasn't encouraged as a child, and I was criticized a lot, and not given the emotional validation that I should have received as a healthy child growing up. What happens is the braver me, the more courageous me, becomes quieter, and the more critical me, my inner critic, becomes very vocal and loud, and that's the voice that I hear predominantly. Sometimes I hear therapists say to people when we're in group therapy, somebody will say something like, I can't do anything right, which clearly is false. It just cannot be true. Just getting out of bed in the morning is doing something right. Perhaps there are a lot of people who don't do that. So if you've done that, you've started your day, right? You've done something right already. I mean, it clearly can't be correct that you don't ever do anything right. And all of us don't sometimes do things that's right. So this feeling that sometimes I do things right, sometimes I don't do things right, that's what it's like to be a human being. It's not what it's like to be dysfunctional, And yet the critical voice will highlight those things where I perceive I haven't done something right. And I will sort of develop this sort of sense that I can't do anything right. These are very common thoughts in depression as well. And so what I often hear people say in group therapy, the therapist will turn to somebody who expresses something like that, and they'll say to them, who's talking now? And the person will think about it a bit and they'll say, it's my mother, because that's what my mother used to say to me. Of course, that's nonsense. It's not your mother. Your mother's not in your head. It's you repeating what your mother said. It's a subtle but very, very important difference because you have no control over what your mother's thinking and saying. But that's not what's going on in your head. What you're doing is you're repeating what your mother says. And that can be profoundly disquieting. But when we turn attention to it and recognize it, that that's what it is, it completely changes our relationship to that voice. Because when we recognize that that is us repeating something, now we can turn our attention to it and say, well, is it really true? Sometimes people will even go back and say, well, what is it about my mother that caused her to say that? She had her own demons, and was very judgmental and critical of me. But when I turn my attention to my life properly, I can see that, in fact, that criticism is undeserved. And so me repeating what somebody else has said to me without any factual basis is profoundly destructive. Does that make sense?
Very much. Yeah. And so the cycle continues, and you work back into the starting point and carry on with that cycle and just perpetuate itself. The cycle of negativity.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's exactly spot on, right? And that's what we do. We call it rumination.
Right.
Our thoughts churning over and over and over, like grass in a cow's stomach, right? That ruminant. Our thoughts churning over and over, and when we ruminate on things and our thoughts spiral around, and they often spiral in a downward direction. My wife sends me to the shop to buy some broccoli and butter. I buy the broccoli, I forget the butter. I'm always letting her down. Can't do anything right. Last time she sent me to the shops, I didn't remember everything either. I don't even bother to write a list. I'm so stupid, I should have written a list. Now I desperately need a drink just to get out of my own head, and I might as well kill myself. I mean, this is what rumination is, yeah?
Well, we've all been there.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, there are other things that influence our interpretations of things, our culture and our society, our friends, our family, our peers at work, which may influence what we choose to expect from ourselves. Yeah. Very importantly, religion. Even if you're not religious, we live in a religious society, so many of our thoughts about ourselves, our place in the world, point of life, what we think is right and wrong, our approaches to sex and friendships, very influenced by culture, society, and religious influences over that. It's important. These are not necessarily means that these are right or wrong, or it just means we need to turn attention and recognize where these things come from so that we can question them, Is this true about my life? How does it serve me? Very important question, right? Come back to this. How does it serve me? What do I get out of holding on to this belief? What do I get out if I was to question this belief? What does it make me do? What does this belief stop me from doing? How does it change my life in a particular direction when my life could go in another direction if I just identified it for what it is? And then ask me, do I really believe it? What evidence do I have that it's true? What evidence do I have that it's not true? Is there another way to look at it? And what evidence do I have that way might be a more appropriate way to view it? And very importantly, I'll come back to this in a sec, but what would I tell a friend who expressed this belief about myself, about the world? What would I tell a friend, right? Friend or a loved one? Because we tend to be far more compassionate. Somebody said, if we spoke to other people the same way we speak to ourselves, we wouldn't have any friends at all. So we don't speak to our friends like that. And yet we do very commonly berate ourselves. Very importantly, right, is media and social media. And that in itself is a whole subject. We tend to compare up. We tend to compare ourselves to people we think have more or are more functional than us. And of course, looking at people who appear to have more and are more functional to us is one of the great irrational beliefs. One of the great irrational beliefs is everybody else is okay. Everyone else is holding it together, and I'm the only one who's struggling. And yet you and I both know, because we spend so much time with other people, there are many, many people who are struggling, and they express that struggle in different ways. One of the gifts of addiction is that unlike people who express their struggling in a pursuit of happiness, fleeting happiness, so focusing on perhaps the wrong things, because happiness is an outcome, not a goal. You become happy from doing things and spending time with other people. car is nice for the first few weeks. For some people, maybe they love cars. It brings them different type of happiness. But for many of us, material items don't bring that happiness. And yet we chase those material goods. We climb the corporate ladder. We move from serial relationships, from one relationship to another. Desperately try and earn money. And the gift of addiction is that we found a different way to respond to that struggle. And the wonderful thing was that ultimately our lives became so dysfunctional that we had to turn and face what it means to be a human being. And a lot of people never get that opportunity. So all of these things contribute to my sense of self and my place in the world. And they all contribute to what I call the little voice in my head. Should I rephrase it? The little voices in my head, because you are not the only voice in your head. There are many of you, and many of those voices are repeating things that you have heard. And so what they do, although they are you, they represent some outside influence, other influential adults, your parents, friends, and they profoundly influence the way we perceive ourselves. So not only are they little voices in my head, but they are my various characters which make up my different personalities. And bearing in mind that they perform different functions, and some of them can be damaged as we grow up. Some of them remain in a childhood state. And they, very importantly to recognize, sometimes when we talk about the 12 steps, we talk about character defects. I think this is what they mean. They're talking about the injured characters. But it's important to recognize that these are not defective. You don't have character defects. What they are, perhaps, is character deficiencies, is a better way to put it. If you recognize that these are not character defects, at one time, in fact, quite the opposite, they were very functional. They were adaptive and protective. We develop some of these characteristics as children to protect ourselves, and as young adults. And as we grow on into early adulthood and later adulthood, depending on what's happening around us, we develop around ourselves shields to protect ourselves in these characters. So they're not defective. Quite the opposite. They're protective and adaptive. But life changes all the time, and as we move forward, we change. And so what happens is these characteristics that once were adaptive and protective no longer serve that purpose, because that purpose doesn't exist anymore. Or we should have grown up and moved through it. And yet we stay in an infantile state, locked in by these characters, when the thing that they were adapting to has long gone. And we should have emerged through them. We should have grown up through these characteristics, and they should have changed with us. But they haven't. They've stayed in an infantile, a childlike state. And so while they were once adaptive and protective, they don't serve that purpose anymore. And what's happened is they've become maladaptive. So they're not by any means of the stretch of the imagination character defects, but they become unhelpful. So these are the characters inside of us. The other thing about the thoughts that we're having, importantly, is to recognize that sometimes they're symptoms of illness. Now, we've said this before, but when part of the body is ill, the symptoms of the illness relate to the part of the body that's ill, right? If I have a chest infection, if I have pneumonia, I'll cough and I'll find it difficult to breathe. That relates to my lungs. If I have a heart attack, I'll get chest pain because the heart muscle becomes painful because it's dying. I won't be able to pump blood around my body, so I don't get enough oxygen to my brain, so I will fall down. That happens because the heart is damaged, so the symptoms relate to a damaged heart. In addiction, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, people who have real attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, just generally uncommon real ADHD, that's an episode in itself, doesn't mean the symptoms won't be there. But when these are all illnesses that relate to an ill brain or a malfunctioning brain in some way, and that's what we mean by illness, right? Illness means that part of the body is not working properly. And in the true sense of the definition of the word illness, I experience symptoms as a consequence of that. Not all diseases have symptoms, but illness relates to my experience of that disease. What happens is that because our brain is ill, and the function of the brain, amongst other things, is to think. When my brain is ill, my thoughts change. And so, let's take depression, for example. What I find is I have a complete negative bias, and this translates into negative thoughts. So some of the symptoms of depression, and the problem with this is it's very difficult to differentiate these symptoms from who I really am, because I relate thoughts to myself. So I have thoughts when I'm depressed, I'm no good. I can't do anything right. My life has been terrible. My life's a waste of time. There's no future for me. I'm always letting other people down. Everyone else thinks that I am ineffectual. Other people know they can't rely on me. Things don't ever go my way. So these are very negative thoughts, but actually in somebody who's depressed or anxious or somebody who's got addiction, they're symptoms of the illness. And we both know that when you stop drinking, when you stop using other drugs, your brain starts to recover. And one of the first things that you notice is that your thoughts start to change. Very, very difficult for people who are in active drinking to imagine that their life will be different, because they've got these thoughts all the time. And you can't, it's like saying, imagine a color that you don't know. You can't. Imagine a thought that you don't know. Imagine a feeling that you don't feel. You can't. So we can't imagine what it might be like if we stop drinking. And sometimes one of the thoughts that comes with that, two thoughts actually, is I don't want to, I can't, and a third thought, there's no point, because life without drugs and alcohol is scary. How will I manage with these thoughts? How will I manage with these feelings? And what that is expressing is this profound lack of awareness that when I stop drinking, in fact, it will be okay, because those thoughts will start to get better. They will start to disappear. And one of the things that we notice when we do stop drinking, one of the first things we notice actually is this terrible sense of anxiety starts to lift from us. This terrible, I used to leave the house with this incredible sense of impending doom. Something terrible is going to happen today. I don't know what it is, but I'm just really anxious and afraid. And I don't know what I'm afraid of. And when you stop drinking, one of the first things for many people that starts to disappear is actually that. And the anxiety starts to lift. Depression often stays, either for a bit longer or for even longer than that. That's okay. It's okay. I mean, your life's falling apart. You're losing money because you're buying all this stuff. You don't feel you've got control over your life. Your relationships are difficult. You're feeling these uncomfortable emotions and feeling. Why would you not be depressed? You know? When depressing things happen, you feel depressed. This doesn't require medication. These are life events, right? What it requires is making sense of them, cultivating around you a community that you can share and learn from, and learning how to manage them. I'm not saying that medication is not helpful for some people, but there are limitations to what medication can do. They will not cure your depression if you're really depressed. They can take the edge off some things. For some people, for many things, they actually don't do very much at all. So we can talk about medication, and I'm certainly not encouraging people who are on medication to stop it, right? Very, very careful. Of course, yeah. Don't ever alter or stop your medication without discussing with your doctor first. However, I do think that if we're not on medication before we start, it requires careful consideration and careful discussion with a professional who can help us to understand whether it's really necessary or not. Because one of the biggest problems I find with medication is it takes the focus away from the other things I should be doing, either instead of medication or in addition to medication. So if you're being medicated for some sort of type of thoughts or feelings, you have to address those in a skill-based learning scenario in addition to taking medication if medication is indicated. So how do I respond to these? How do I manage these? What coping skills do I need to learn and develop? Yeah. So we'll see this. We'll talk about these in detail when we talk about finding meaning in life, because that's where the coping skills arise. So these are very, very important thoughts in my head which influence the way I interpret events. And let's just mention two specific types of thoughts. Very, very overview. We'll do another program on these in detail because they're important. One is intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are just arise in my head. I don't choose them. And in fact, much of our thinking arises like this. We spend 3/4 of our day in mind wandering, half to 3/4 of our day in mind wandering, where the thoughts just arise. We don't choose them. Of course, we can purposefully choose thoughts, but most of the time we don't. They just arise. But they profoundly in themselves influence our relationship and experience in the world, because it's our thoughts and what we pay attention to that influence our experience in the world. So it's important to recognize these thoughts. And sometimes intrusive thoughts can be quite distressing. Common intrusive thoughts that people feel are some of the ones we've spoken about already in relation to depression. They're about me, I'm no good, I can't get on with people, I'm always letting people down, those sorts of things. And what they are is they're very black and white. There's no in between. I'm always doing this. I am no good. As opposed to, well, and this is one of the things we can do to address these intrusive thoughts, is just challenge them. I can't do anything right. Well, really? Is that likely to be true? Do you think that I could have reached the age of 58 if I can't do anything right? And have a happy family and functional children and hold down a job, and have some friends at least, if I can't do anything right? And so one way to address these intrusive thoughts is just to challenge them and to identify alternative thoughts. We can substitute for those thoughts, and you can do that beforehand. Just think of one thing you've done right. Like, my son is happy, successful. Well, you had to have some sort of role in it. Or I made somebody smile today. And you know what? You can just have that at the back of your head, and when these thoughts come up, say, but hang on a minute, my son's happy and successful. I did something that made someone smile today. Automatically, it challenges that thought. It doesn't mean that there are some things that you can improve on, and there are some behaviors you have that are unhelpful, but that's not everything. And when you can change your perspective on it like that, then in fact you can address those other things in a much more mature and functional way. Some of the other intrusive thoughts are just things that are very strange that pop up in our head, like, I'm afraid I'm going to punch someone in the face. So there's a little old lady standing at the top. I could push her down the stairs if I wanted to. These just arise. What does that say about me? Well, what evidence have you got that it's likely you'll do that? Have you ever done it in the past? Most of us have not, right? And despite those thoughts, and I don't know where they come from, but everyone has them. And when you talk about people, they talk, I'm driving along the road, I'm afraid I'm going to drive on the other side of the road and crash the car. There are things like this. They're just intrusive thoughts. They just arise, and they're very difficult to account for, and they're not necessary to account for. Just recognizing from what they are and naming them. This is an intrusive thought. I didn't choose it. The most important thing is to not try and push it away, is to welcome it, to accept it. Because you can't not think about something. It's like, don't think of a cow, right? Yeah, so to not push it away. If you fight your thoughts, they'll just fight back. Push it away, it'll just push back at you, and it'll stay there, and then you start to ruminate over them. Some of these intrusive thoughts are a little more distressing, like one of the common intrusive thoughts that we've met people who talk about these thoughts is that I'm continually afraid of my family dying, or in fact it might be better if it happened now, and what does this say about me as a father? And when you talk to these people, and you say, that's an intrusive thought, say, I know, but it's incredibly distressing. Well, then perhaps it's worthwhile talking about it a little more in detail, right? Do you really think it would be better if your family was dead? And they usually respond this, absolutely not. I love my family. I'm terrified that something will happen to them. And I think that, especially in a life where we've sort of grown up with addiction and our coping skills are not mature yet, and we're still learning those, these thoughts are very difficult to deal with because it seems to say something about me. Am I a terrible father? Am I a psychopath? Is it true that I want this to happen? And yet when I turn attention inward, I recognize that not only is this true that I want it to happen, but one of the reasons that I might be feeling it is because I just cannot bear the responsibility of being a father in a world where I really am incapable of protecting, at least for the rest of their lives, my children. And they have to grow up into their own people and emerge into the world. And I have no influence over what will happen to them. They will make their own choices. And so if something were to happen to them, it would be better if it happened now, because then it would be over and I wouldn't be terrified anymore. And in fact, then I could also go back to drinking, because that's what I planned to do in the first place, right? The common intrusive thought amongst alcoholics is something catastrophic could happen, because if it does, then I can fall apart and go back to drinking. Very irrational thought, right? But it can be very distressing for people. So in fact, some of these intrusive thoughts, you're not having them because you're a bad person. I mean, clearly they just arrive. But maybe they do say something about you. Maybe they are saying, identify, you are a responsible parent. You are a loving parent. And the anxiety that you feel from that comes because you care and because you love them. And so maybe what it does is it helps us to do things. First of all, to talk about that and make sense of it, so that next time it arises, it doesn't drag me down. But also to appreciate the time that I have with them now. Yeah.
Absolutely. Excuse me. Another common one that comes up regularly, and for me as well, is suicidal ideation. That is very common in some of the facilities where we spend time with other people like that. And you can see how debilitating and how heavy it is for some of those people to be carrying that load. And it's having experienced it, it's just absolutely devastating, I think.
Yes. And it can be very distressing on one hand. On the other hand, it can actually be quite comforting, suicidal ideation.
Yeah.
Suicidal ideation is, when we talk about it, we mean it might be better if I'm dead. It doesn't normally come with a specific plan on how to do it or a time, and it doesn't usually actually even translate into a suicidal attempt. It can do, but most of the time it doesn't. And I think, I do think that it, again, we talk about what we need to do with some of these thoughts. So the first thing is to talk about them with people you trust, and you'll find that in the addiction recovery community, the overcomers, as you call them, to write about it. Because what writing does is it helps us make sense of our thoughts. And what you notice when you write is your thoughts flow. And it's for you. No one else is going to read this. So it doesn't matter how well you think or you don't think you write. It's just to put some of those thoughts down on paper. And as you write, the thoughts flow out. And more importantly than that even, I think, is once it's written, it distances you from it. You see it more objectively. And when we write, we use creative parts of our brain that we don't use when we think and when we speak. So it helps us to get a better perspective on what's going on. And like other intrusive thoughts, suicidal ideation, it's okay to recognize it as that. This is just a thought, actually. And it's not necessarily telling us anything.
Right. Well, especially with a lot of the conversations I've been having recently about that particular subject, it's interesting how many are linked to feelings of being burdensome. 3 or 4 people, the last 3 or 4 people I spoke to about this, all mentioned the fact that their fear is that they're a burden and they want to stop being a burden on everybody. And that's It's really sad to hear, but it's also not true.
It's not true, but I do think that particular thought is a bit of a red flag, right? Because this is one of the feelings that is more commonly associated actually with suicide attempts, feeling that other people would be better off if I'm not there. So I think the point that you're making and is important and helpful is to recognize some of these other thoughts that arise with that, right? And again, to talk about it. It's very, very important to talk about it and not to keep this isolated. One of the really interesting things that you and I have experienced recently is when we were talking about this at one of the meetings. There's a meeting that we go to where there's approximately 30 people. And you were actually talking about this particular, and we went around the room. Then the percentage of the people, the number of people in that room who had suicidal ideation astonished me. It was more common than it was not.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that this is an addiction community. But I think that...
well, it's still a sample of a population.
Yeah, sure. Sometimes it's also a profound expression of inability, a feeling of inability to cope, that I could end it all, I remember for myself, there was just this real need for things to go away. And I've experienced that very, very strongly in several times in my life, all of which have resulted in big decisions which ended badly. But I didn't talk about them. What I did is I just undertook an action to make things go away. And some of those actions have been very damaging to various things.
Yeah, so very quickly from my side, I think there's two major remedies that have really, really, really helped me with what we've been talking about today. First is get a mentor. If you want to call that person a sponsor, it doesn't have to be linked to the recovery community. It can be within your faith or your religion, work, or it doesn't matter. Very, very, very important. Somebody who I consider wise, actually a few characteristics, but wisdom, non-judgmental, very important for that person. And the second is to have more of these conversations. One of the things that the richness of your and my friendships brought is the ability or the privilege rather to have somebody that I can have these conversations with and wants to have these conversations with me. I sometimes think that this is pretty much all we talk about, obviously, I thought. And I'm richer and I dare say wiser for it.
Yes. And I think the lovely thing about having a mentor too is, we say, well, what would I say to a friend who is expressing these feelings? The trusted mentor, you can say to them, well, what do you think about that, right? What would you say to a friend? How do I come across to you? Let me give an example. So I grew up believing that I was ugly and that I was an idiot. That's how I grew up. It wasn't that I felt like I was an idiot. I was an idiot. Like I was a boy. I grew up as a boy and I grew up as an idiot. I was just, through various situations, that's what I believed about myself. And so what it did is it became extremely difficult to move on into a adolescent and young adult life like that, because I had no self-esteem, no self-worth. I couldn't make decisions for myself. I always needed validation from other people. Very important, if anyone else expressed an opinion that was different to mine, they were attacking me and I was an idiot and they knew I was an idiot, which made relationships very difficult. And so I developed this defensiveness around myself, whereas I would characterize them as an idiot before they'd characterize me as an idiot. And I was always angry. I was always fighting with somebody because I always had to be right. Because if I wasn't right, it meant I was an idiot. When I stopped drinking, this occurred very rapidly. I remember being very conscious of this. Somebody sent me something that I'd written that had been reviewed by somebody else. And that's what I was doing for a living. So I was always having my work reviewed by other people. It always made me angry, right? Because they would change my commas and my grammar. And they were basically, when they did that, they weren't.
It was a malicious.
Yes. With well-intentioned actions, they were helping me to make it better. That's not how I saw it, of course. I saw it as a direct threat that they were criticizing me and destroying my work. And so that led to a lot of conflictual situations, especially since for much of the work that I did, it was for other people, so I didn't actually have control over the end result. But I remember one day somebody phoned me and said, look, I've sent your work back to you. Sit down before you have a look at it, because it's covered in red ink. They've made lots of changes. And I opened it up, and I'll never forget this moment. It was profound for me. I expected to feel angry, but I didn't. Something had changed inside of me, and I think it was partly because I was learning coping skills and learning to identify emotions, and some of those really horrible negative emotions had started to lift from me. The first thought that came into my head was, let me see if I could see their point. And that took me off in completely new directions that my head had never been in before, because it could be, let me see if I can see their point. Maybe I'm wrong and they're right. Now what they've done for me is they have prevented me from actually making a fool of myself, because what I'm putting out here was wrong. And they have put it right. I've learned something. Maybe they're wrong and I'm right. Well, now I have an opportunity to reassess what I've written, because clearly there will be other people who have opinions, and I need to make myself more clear and explain. And maybe this person's expressing a common misperception that I would be able to clarify in that piece of writing. Maybe they're right and I'm right, and they've just got a different perspective on it. This is what I think was mostly actually the case in all of the writing I did. It was seldom that I'd done stuff that's wrong, for various reasons, but it was also very seldom that the reviewer had said something that was wrong. And what that is expression of community, right? That's why we commune with each other, because together we can create something that is better than what we could have created by ourselves. We can solve problems better than how we can solve problems by ourselves. One of the other things that I noticed was very common was that they didn't understand what I'd said in my writing. I hadn't made myself clear enough. And so their review of my work gave me an opportunity to rewrite it and rewrite it with clarity. And so what you notice about all of these different responses, the responses and choices I'd never had before in my life, because I just dismissed other people as an idiot. What happens then? I dismiss them as an idiot. I feel inauthentic because I'm not sure they're an idiot, and I feel attacked and I feel criticized. So it just reinforces the fact that I feel like an idiot. And then it changes the way I respond to people. It becomes a completely vicious circle. I feel like an idiot, so I call you an idiot, makes me feel more like an idiot. So I'm continually fighting with people.
And very importantly, there can only be one outcome.
Only one outcome. Exactly. And I don't even know what that outcome is. It's just locking you in this vicious spiral of conflict.
Well, it's not good.
No.
Let's say that.
And lack of self-esteem, and continually feeling. And Dr. Phil said that, he said, we make our own worst fears come true. I'm afraid I'm an idiot. And so how I respond to that feeling perpetuates my feeling of being an idiot. Instead of recognizing, well, that's an intrusive thought. What would I say to a friend who expressed that? Well, what would you say to a friend who said, I'm an idiot?
Understandable.
First point, right? Anyone who'd grown up in that environment that you grew up in, with that constant criticism, with that conflict around you, might feel like that.
Exactly.
So it's understandable that you might feel like that. Lots of people say to me, what I'd say to an idiot is, you're not an idiot. That doesn't help, right? Because that's irrelevant. That's how I feel. What I'm doing is I'm expressing a feeling. I'm not expressing a reality. Somebody said to me after a talk, I gave a talk to some psychiatrists once on this subject, actually, and someone came up to me afterwards and they said, oh, Dr. Webb, we don't see you as an idiot. We don't think you're an idiot. I said to her, you're missing the point. I think I'm an idiot. So that's the starting point, right? It's understandable. Anyone who'd experienced what you've experienced, if I grew up with your genes and your education and your family and your experiences and your work experience, I'd be you. And so it's not only understandable that you are who you are, it's inevitable that you should be who you are. And that's a lovely realization, because what it tells you is you're okay. It's okay to be who you are. It's inevitable that you would be who you are. So it can't be anything other than that. It's not okay to stay who you are. You've got to move forward and grow. But to recognize that it's okay that I am who I am now is a wonderful, wonderful starting point. Because you're not continually wishing things to be different. What you are, you're focusing on the future, on how they can be different. So that first question, right? The first response, yeah, that's understandable.
Oh, you want my second?
Yeah, what would you say next?
Probably, what evidence do you have that you are an idiot? Or maybe what evidence do you have that you're not?
Yeah, of course. And you might say to them, look, I can understand why you feel like that, but I don't see you as an idiot. I haven't seen anything that you've done that's given me an indication that you're an idiot. What evidence do you have that you're an idiot? What evidence do you have that you're not an idiot? Let's think of some situations. Maybe you could even give them an example. The other day when you were talking at that meeting and everyone was listening to you and somebody came up to you afterwards and said, thank you so much. I've been wondering about that. And we mentioned him before, but this guy had a young man, he's 19, had profound influence on me at that meeting, who said he can't do anything right. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And what he was expressing was exactly this. Just an incapability to catch himself doing something right. Because it just can't be true that you go through your life doing nothing right. But he had been so beaten down and criticized that he had this complete negative bias to, he noticed everything that was negative, and anything that was positive, it wasn't that he didn't notice it, it just flew over his head. It just didn't even register on this, because he had this complete feeling that I'm no good, I can't do anything right. And yet we'd known him for a few weeks, and so much of what he was doing and saying and helping and being of value to the other people in the group made him an incredibly valuable and important member of that group. And when he left, there was an energy gone from that group. Do you remember?
Very, very much. More importantly, in that meeting where he expressed, it might have even cried, I can't remember, how he can never do anything right. How many people afterwards said, I felt like that, you're not right.
Yes.
And the support that he got and the validation.
And ironically, just expressing that was doing such an enormous service to the people.
Exactly.
So that people could say, I'm not alone. So yeah, I mean, those are some of the questions you might ask yourself. What's another way to look at it? I'm going to make a suggestion, because I found this very helpful. And I call it affirmations to an infant. If you think back to yourself as a baby, lying in the cot, as a loving friend to that baby, to yourself, to your child self, or you can imagine yourself at the age of 4, experiencing the criticism that has now made such a profound change and difference in your life. If you could speak to that infant or that small child at that time, what would you say to them?
Are you asking? I'm really glad you're here.
Tia, I'm really glad you're here. I love you.
Love you. And you're not an idiot.
And you will love your life. You will be a profound help to other people if you choose to be, I was going to add a last one on there. And I don't, just think of a few things to say to this infant. You are worth not drinking for.
That's awesome. You haven't said that before.
And to the child, I can see how you're hurting. Anyone in the situation would feel that way. Life is not always going to be like this. And you will grow up into your own human being. You will not grow up into your father. You will not grow up into your mother. You will not grow up into your uncle. There's you. You will grow up into yourself. And while some of those voices are in your head, they're still you. They're still you repeating those things. And so what we have to do is dig into this Malay, is that the right word? Dig into this cacophony of voices and listen very carefully for our own voice that's coming through. Because sometimes the chatter is so loud we can't even hear our own voice. There's a strong, small sense of self that comes through, which can quieten the others and add some perspective.
Yeah. What a lovely place to end. This was definitely the best one we've had so far. I really, really enjoyed this. It's lovely just revisiting these things and hashing them out and talking and of course spending time with each other. Of course, Andy. Thank you very much for tuning in. As normal, or as usual, we'll leave some information in the bio down below. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.